History repeats itself because the present hasn't listened.
Black lives matter. Indigenous lives are sacred.
A lot of the time, the same thing that both Native people and Black people are fighting for, the end goal is the exact same thing.
Both the Black Loyalists and the Mi'kmaq, being outsiders to British society, would form a bond that would last all the way until present day.
The histories of Mi'kmaq and African Nova Scotian communities have intertwined for over 400 years. But there are tensions around the politics of identity.
I always used the term I was too Black to be Native and too Native to be Black. So you kind of fell in between.
The system's still attacking both groups of people. We're both still marginalized and facing the white supremacy.
When you're a person of color, we have a saying here that, you know, Nova Scotia is the deep south of Canada.
Ready, boys? Woo!
And when Mi'kmaq assert treaty rights, racism rears its head.
Those are our rights, our treaty rights.
You ever work a day in your life?
Imagine them. They need it. It was heartbreaking at first to be looking at videos and being like, man, like I walked the graduation stage with some of you guys.
The Mi'kmaq would also help the Black Loyalists with surviving in the climate of Nova Scotia.
Natil Batiste is Mi'kmaq and Black. Her partner Robert Downey is from North Preston, the largest African Nova Scotian community. Their own relationship is part of a long history of Mi'kmaq and Black connections.
I needed to see that we were taught, well, my ancestors were taught how to survive, because you can't just come on land and know. You need to know who can I lean on and how can we survive as people. And then, like you said, those two coexist. And we were never taught that in school.
No.
We were never known of the Black and Native relationship at all.
Eventually, the 1,000 Black Loyalists that landed in Shelburne would make their way out here to Birchtown.
The British promised freedom and land to slaves who fought in the American Revolutionary War. Over 3,000 Black Loyalists arrived here in 1783. But inequality was pervasive. Birchtown, Nova Scotia, is the site of North America's first recorded race riots.
That's what they're fighting against. They're wanting, hey, we can be treated the same, we can be looked at the same. It shouldn't be based on our race, and that's
skin,
it's history
like
just repeating itself in different ways over and over and over again.
Right?
And that's really what's going on in today's world as well.
The acceptance
with George Floyd and wanting equality when it comes to policing.
So that's what you passed him there? Yes, sir. What do we do?
Put your hand up there.
Please don't shoot me, please, man.
On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was killed by white police officer Derek Chauvin, who kneeled on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes.
I can breathe.
Like everyone else around the world, Joy Carvery-Taylor watched events unfold.
Mama.
So I've spent like most of 2020 just crying, like seriously, just sitting home. Like every time I think about George Floyd and like calling for his mother, I'm like, oh my God, my heart as a mother, I can't handle that. No. Yeah, see, I'm like, I can't even like talk about it. It's just hard it's a lot, it's heavy. It's, you know, you wear it all the time.
An RCMP officer shot and killed an Indigenous man.
Within a month of Floyd's death, police in New Brunswick killed 2 Indigenous people during wellness checks. Rodney Levi, who was Mi'kmaq, and Chantel Moore from the Clawqueat Nation in British Columbia.
It's like these 2 communities that I have on social media, and my Black community is hurting so badly right now. And the Mi'kmaq community is also hurting just as badly. And so our household is both. It's just heavy all the time. My daughter and I are black and white, and my husband and his son are Mi'kmaq and Ojibwe. So, yeah, we make it work together. Richard and I were friends since 1998. We both know what it's like to be oppressed. We both can identify racism very easily.
We have discussions around the dinner table about these very topics. So when they go into the world, I feel like they're as armed as they can be, and they're going to feel the wrath of hatred and anger and all these things, like about Indigenous people, about black people.
A history of racism for two marginalized communities.
The heart of the city is the Grand Parade.
Through the 1950s, Mi'kmaq and black people were not allowed in bars and restaurants. Indigenous people weren't even considered citizens of Canada until 1956 and couldn't vote until 1960.
90% of my community are living on $6 a day.
Too many blacks in a nightclub make a lot of white people uncomfortable.
There's an unwritten policy in some of the bars in downtown Halifax. Let's keep black people out.
Racism has impacted everything from education to employment, child welfare, and policing. Human rights activist and educator Lynn Jones has kept track, collecting news clippings for 5 decades.
I didn't realize how the same thing, how much it's been repeated over time, and how we haven't had government become accountable for what it's done.
Both Mi'kmaq and black communities suffered forced relocation. Joy's family roots are tied to Africville, where her father grew up.
It's sad because he didn't get to raise us here. There's a lot of playing with terms right now with black people being not settlers, not colonizers. We were just brought here. We don't know necessarily where we can go back to. This is as far as we can go, so this is where we just, hey, I'm from Africville.
For 150 years, Africville was home to generations of the black community. Halifax City refused to provide services like water. In 1964, City Council voted to remove the residents, and by 1970, Africville was demolished.
The spirit of Africville was the church.
I came here when I was in grade 5.
Yeah, and my mom, she made apple pie and homemade root beer.
Joy is working on a book featuring photographs and stories of the elders who lived there, bringing them back to the park where Africville once stood.
And it was just we used to run through the woods and pick berries and.
Yeah. And I used to fish eels.
And then around May or June, that's when the mackerel would run, right?
Like, there's so much joy in Africville, and all you hear is the bad. So I really hope that my book gives people a balanced perspective so they can, just see our community differently.
It's not well known, but Africville was also home to Mi'kmaq people, typically women who married into the community.
I'm Métis from my grandmother. Okay. She was pure Indian. Yeah.
There's nowhere that I've gone within a black community in Nova Scotia and have not found black and native people.
Tanya Paris is Black and First Nations, both Mi'kmaq and Cree, an identity she celebrates.
Because there were so many of us that fell in between those cracks, that it was almost like a culture within itself. For me, what I chose to do was to bridge the gap between the two communities. In 1991, I became the first black and Indigenous woman to ever become a police officer for the Halifax Police Department. There was a lot of internal racism and sexism.
Tanya's policing days are behind her, but she still carries a deep-rooted fear of police.
And police are here to serve and protect. So why do I feel that when I see a police officer, why would I get sick to my stomach in fear when I see them?
Even though you were a police officer?
Even though I was a police officer. When I see a police officer, I get sick.
I am sorry for our actions that have caused you pain.
An apology from the Halifax police chief after a 2019 report outlined what the African Nova Scotian community already knew, that police street checks and racial profiling target the black community. In October, Nova Scotia Premier Stephen McNeil apologized for systemic racism in the justice system for black and Indigenous people.
Today, I say enough. I want you to know I hear you, I see you, I believe you, and I am sorry.
But the apology and a plan for police reform came with no notice or consultation.
Why would you not engage the community that you're apologizing to?
Lynn Jones says the top-down approach is part of the problem.
So you keep doing it over and over and over again, and we keep telling you it's not acceptable to us, it's offensive, it's racist. The very thing that you say that you're about tearing down, you're actually perpetuating.
And the reality on the ground, missing and murdered Indigenous women, systemic racism in policing, higher incarceration rates for black and Indigenous people.
And being a person who's both black and Native, there was just never a situation I was getting myself in. And then on top of that, being a woman, it's like the three most deadliest things to be in this time.
When we come back, the politics of identity and what racism looks like for Mi'kmaq asserting rights.
There's a couple of hundred non-natives out there.
Because of the way that I was raised, I was exposed to both my black and Indigenous heritage from an extremely young age. And I was told when I did my artwork, I was appropriating Mi'kmaq art. It really hurt my feelings because what is Mi'kmaq art? If you have a Mi'kmaq hand that draws a circle, that's Mi'kmaq art. How does one oppressed group oppress another oppressed group? It baffles me.
You know, at the beginning there was a lot of denial. People said, no, I'm not black. Well, me, I said, gee, I am black and I'm very proud of it. You don't have to go anywhere.
Ernest Johnson lives in Eskasoni, the largest Mi'kmaq community. His great-grandfather was black.
According to my grandfather, and the blacks and the Mi'kmaq mingled just as well as the French. But there was more black people marrying the Mi'kmaq people than the French marrying the Mi'kmaq. I think they were very compatible, so the black people were very welcomed into the Mi'kmaq community and vice versa. There was this undiscriminating people that saw themselves as people.
Looking back, Ernest says for the Mi'kmaq, moving on reserve and living under the laws of the Indian Act was a form of segregation.
When the government stepped in, they put these bylaws and laws that trespassing on reserve, so that that kind of put a stop to the integration.
Once we left Birchtown and Shelburne, I learned that when the black loyalists came here, that's how we learned to survive. And then we branched off to like Africville, Cape Breton, Newfoundland. And then here, you know, so I learned that the natives played a big role in teaching us how to survive in the wilderness.
This is basically like a reserve.
Yeah, I've said that too.
This is a reserve.
Robert Downey grew up here in North Preston. His uncle Derek Ross says the elders talked about the Mi'kmaq connection.
We have it in us. Here we go.
Like others here in North Preston, Derek is a card holder with the Eastern Woodland Métis. While Métis was a common slang for mixed ancestry, Métis are specific nations in Ontario and the prairies. Eastern Métis groups here have pushed for rights. The Mi'kmaq Nation has been clear, Métis do not exist in Nova Scotia. But political tensions aside, Natil Batiste says the Métis card separates Black and Mi'kmaq people rather than bring them together.
To go and give them a false history and a false name, that's just damaging on all levels. There's a way to get it the right way and be able to honor your roots that way.
Canada defines who is a status Indian under the Indian Act.
So even though I identify as 50%, my mom is full, my grandmother's full, I'm 50% Black, 50% Native. My daughter's not status, and she's 1/4. I have to live with knowing that I wasn't able to pass that on to her. My daughter will be raised to honor and respect her, both sides of who she is.
Mi'kmaq, Ilnu, the people, Black, African Nova Scotian, Indigenous Black, Afro-Métis, Afro-Ilnu, Black and First Nations, Black and Mi'kmaq. Whatever the words, it's something to be celebrated.
Indigenous people come in all shades, all hair textures, all phenotypes. We look different. Different tribes look different. There's no one set look to what we call Indian looks like.
When it comes to identity, terms like settler shouldn't apply to the Black community.
I found it quite offensive to talk about African people as being settlers in this land. The racism that we experienced when we came, coming in chains through slavery and whatever, that certainly is not what one would equate with being settlers.
We weren't trying to take anything. We weren't trying to do this whole thing. We were just this casualty of it. So there's not really like an accurate term for us. Nobody really has a claim to this land more than the people who were here first. So that's who I think we all owe that to. But I don't know how that works out as well. So.
The struggle over resources throughout colonialism has been with white settlers.
When you look at how the land is now being distributed and the rights that other people have felt that they are entitled to, it's a very protective and possessive things like the land and fishing and things like that, which can divide people more by their race if something like that is to come into question. And that's something that I feel still takes place in this area of the province.
And 2 months later, just 35 minutes away from Birchtown, a mob of angry, non-Indigenous fishermen surrounded a building where Mi'kmaq fisherman Jason Marr stored his lobster.
I've got myself barricaded in lobster pound here. There's a couple of hundred non-natives out there. They said they won't let me leave unless they have my lobsters.
Marr got out, but protesters destroyed his lobster catch while police watched.
It's come to the point where it's a matter of, do our lives matter? This truly is systemic racism. If it was 300 of our people and 40 of theirs, that place would be full of cops.
A few days later, that lobster pound went up in flames. Violence, threats, aimed at the Mi'kmaq.
He hated me. I asked him why. He said, "'Cause you're an Indian."
The Mi'kmaq have a treaty right to fish, hunt, and gather resources to earn a living. When the Sabaganagati First Nation kicked off its lobster fishery in western Nova Scotia, local commercial fish harvesters harassed them on the water, vandalized their gear, and stole their traps. You can see the Mi'kmaq here taking them back.
For as long as I can remember, our people been fighting for a right to fish. So we get so used to the racism, we almost accept it.
The Mi'kmaq are fishing out of Saulniéville, one of the Acadian communities that dot the coastline. Natil arrives with friends to deliver supplies.
It was a call that I put out on Facebook, and most of the people who had offered donations came from the North Preston, East Preston area.
Natil grew up in the Acadia First Nation, just a 40-minute drive away. Her younger brother, Jason, who still lives on the reserve, has been coming to show support for weeks.
We had people coming in saying very racist and rude remarks to the people that were just sitting here trying to protect their boats.
A lot of this hate that is being spread is just people that are uninformed of what's going on.
It was heartbreaking at first to be looking at videos and being like, man, like I walked a graduation stage with some of you guys.
It is upsetting because a lot of the people that I've, got into some arguments with were like some of my really good friends.
Being Native is your struggle. And it's even a struggle for him because he has black sisters.
I have Mi'kmaq in my blood, but it was something I wasn't fortunate enough to grow up in culturally, and that has been a distinct kind of
direct result of colonization.
Exactly.
Is what happened with her family. If colonization didn't pan out the way that it did, there wouldn't have been anything stopping her from knowing her background. But that's racism in itself.
At the end of the day, racism is a white issue that happens to affect Indigenous and Black people. It's not our issue. So if it's not our issue, we can't end it. It has to be the person that's issue it belongs to.
The Black Lives Matter movement has gained momentum in 2020.
And for me, it's like strike while the iron's hot.
And then when we think that we're at the very end, it's people like all of you right there that lift us up.
The end goal for Lynn Jones is reparation for the transatlantic slave trade. That would start with an apology.
And on top of that, we haven't developed any real programs or services to address it. So that's where this whole call for reparations comes.
There's also a call for reparations for the destruction of Africville.
But I'm here, still waiting to be compensated.
I mean, it's never going to heal the emotional and psychological wounds and scars that we suffer.
Reparations. For the Mi'kmaq, reconciliation.
When I come to remember the blood of my ancestors who run through me, I can never lose. Being a woman who is Black and being a woman who is Native, and the huge, huge history that's just behind that, all my ancestors are survivors and they're all warriors because I'm here.